I'm not a morning person. I haven't had my fix of coffee, and I was rushed here just to make sure I'd be here on time. This morning I was wondering how to be irrelevant. Because irrelevance is an art form that liberal arts encourages, sustains, and nurtures. But it's an art form that has to be meaningful in a civilizational sense. And I must confess I'm the only one of a family of scientists who took liberal arts by glorious default. And now I have an identity crisis. So what I'm going to do is begin with two stories as a tribute to a family of scientists, where science itself was an act of reading and rereading. Because for me, the hermeneutics of suspicion matches the kind of skepticism that science brings. There's a balance, there's a reciprocity. And as a creature who loved science fiction in school and did little else, let me recount two stories. One is by Walter Miller's The Canticle for Leibowitz. It's about a society that begins with a nuclear bomb. Civilization is destroyed, and a group of monks decide to recreate it. They have nothing there. And all they know is they see a certain hieroglyph, a little bit of text. No one knows what it is, but they bring in a set of priests to decode it. And they work on it. And slowly over time, they realize it's a very complex equation. And eventually the priests decode it. They realize the meaning of it. And the story ends where it begins, with another nuclear explosion and another end of civilization. The other story comes from my favorite science fiction man, Ray Bradbury, Fahrenheit 451. And I think it was made into a brilliant movie starring Julie Christie and Oscar Werner. But more brilliantly, I think it takes the idea of the book seriously. It's a society where books are destroyed, and then in a dissenting group, every man becomes a book. You become Hamlet, Freud, and you become Robert Musil's Man Without Qualities. You take Proust. The idea is that eventually every man becomes author. And the ethics of memory and the ethics of innovation come together in a fascinating way in a liberal arts department. You push science, you push the classic. But in creating a space between the two, you create a different world of constant reading and incessant immersion. What I want to do is to say that liberal arts is a way of relooking at some of the myths of foreign policy. I think it's a brilliant way of challenging the illiteracy of Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. And I want to, in fact, begin with it because what looks marginal, what has been sustained in little corners as a variety of imaginations, has political possibilities for reseeding democracy as a way of life. In fact, if I were to begin today, the democratization of democracy would begin not with the Constitution, but with the liberal arts syllabus. And it's this context that I want to just take 4 stories of 4 different things I've been working on. And one of the first things I really want to do is, you need a creation myth. Any society needs a creation myth. And the Rollins-India collaboration needs a creation myth of a different kind. And the creation myth, you reread the story. You retell it in many ways. And the storyteller takes over. And for me, the creation myth that I want to recreate is 1492. 1492 is the beginning of the age of Columbus. 1492 is when the Spanish eventually defeated the Moors at Granada. But 1492 is also the defeat of one of the most pluralistic, tolerant societies ever invented in history. Moorish Spain, whether you take Amitabh Bose's In an Antique Land, or you take Amin Malouf's Leo Africanus, it's a brilliant story of how Christians, Jews, and Muslims live together in an everydayness. And it's an everydayness we're looking for. In terms of a vocabulary we no longer command, in terms of an understanding we no longer have. It is intercultural, interracial. It's not just the modesty of being interdisciplinary. And it's this that I'm really moving for. And it's in this context that I want to go back and recover this period, because it's a different way of looking at the relation between conquered and colonized. Conqueror and colonized. It's a different way of reading these things. And it's in this context that I want to say, you have to begin with 1492 as a rereading, not only of the West, but the possibility of the other Wests. And two, the kind of Wests Africa and India invented. In fact, I remember one of the most, you got to understand that if the colonized is not always an inferior creature. You know, I come from a Brahminic family which thought it was superior to the West. and felt so. And in fact, I remember one of my uncles quoting Ananda Kumaraswamy by saying, we are like priests. And he referred to a group of Inca priests who bowed before their conquerors in deep disdain. That confidence is not a kind of arrogance. It's an attempt to say any culture is incomplete. And it's the incompletion of cultures which creates the possibility of anthropology and liberal arts. It's a position that Levi-Strauss took when he was arguing against race, where he said any culture by definition is incomplete. And it's only the conversation of cultures that can make humanity complete. But that act of completion is an incessant act of storytelling, which one plays out every day. And in replaying 1492, we go back to the reign of the storyteller. We recreate, we reinvent. We find out how, to a certain extent, pluralism was a part of a way of life. In fact, for me, a recent statement by the Dalai Lama captures this brilliantly. A few years ago, he was responding to George Bush I. And Dalai Lama, with a terrific sense of humor, said, George Bush brings out the Muslim in me. I think, in a way, it captured that sense of comparison without in any way creating a hierarchy of beliefs. But the world was pluralistic. And in fact, I remember another example told to me by an old friend of mine, a kind of nomadic teacher. You might know him, Raimundo Panica from the University of Santa Barbara. And Panica, I remember, he used to sort of move around in a kind of old lungi and a kurta, frayed kurta. One day he walked into my room and he said, you're Shiv. I said, yes. I didn't dare to ask who the great Raimundo Panica was. Panica had 6 PhDs on everything from chemistry to Sanskrit. And I think spoke about 10 languages fluently without knowing the difference. And he said something brilliant. And he said, for India to be confident, we should leave a bit of each colony alive. We need a bit of Pondicherry as France. We need a bit of Serampore for the Danish. Of course, it's a bit difficult to pick that piece of England you want. But let's assume it's a cricket field. But I think what he really wanted to talk about was that colonization doesn't end, or nationalism doesn't end the conversation of cultures. In fact, I remember the English once complaining during the Industrial Commission report that he said, the Indians have by-hearted us. And he said, by-heart is in fact an Indian invention. Yes, we by-hearted the English. We by-hearted the Bill of Rights. We by-hearted William Shakespeare. We by-hearted Newton and Locke. And as Niraj C. Chowdhury once said when he went to England after 50 years of admiring the Imperium, the English don't write English anymore. What I want to emphasize here is the possibility, the humor, the return of irony and ambiguity to a subject which has to recreate things. Everything from the everydayness of life around migration to the whole question of a new kind of foreign policy. And it's in this context that I want to take 3 events. I have spent the last 10 years writing a book on science and nationalism. And as one of my teachers told me, you'll spend the next 10 years also writing the book on science and nationalism. Because he says, I have archive fever. But one of the things I found fascinating is when you look at the records of nationalism, you look at theosophy, you look at the amount of availability of eccentricity in India. You know what's beautiful in India is the amount of English, Russian, American eccentrics who were a part of the Indian national movement. I mean, just think of it. Alan Octavian Hume. I don't know why people called him the father of the Indian Congress. He was 19th century's greatest ornithologist. He in fact started Stray Birds, which is a major magazine for ornithology today. And then you have someone like Nikolai Roerich. In fact, he started a magazine called Flamma in India, which actually predicted that America would be the new melting pot society, long before America dreamed of it. And he started, in fact, the Green Cross to save institutions of heritage in the same way the Red Cross could be started. I wish a school of liberal arts were to revive some of these ideas. But what really struck me is when I was looking at the archives, the way we constructed science in India. In fact, it's the history, the secret history of the University of Shantiniketan, where Rabindranath Tagore actually spends his time talking to a Scottish biologist named Patrick Geddes and an outstanding physicist turned botanist, turned physiologist, turned cosmopolitan called Jagdish Chandra Bose. I remember a paper that Shockley wrote about communication waves recently in the Bell Physics Review in the early 50s. He said, there was Bose and the rest is toilet paper. A very Shockley-like statement. Of course, when he extended it to race, there was a kind of pandemonium we haven't recovered from. But pushing it further, if you look at the way they constructed it, Tagore was not a nationalist. He was anti-national. Bose was not a nationalist. He was neither an internationalist. For a brown man from the colony to be a scientist who could challenge the best of the world, he said, we have to understand that the West has a way of patronizing us. If they recognize us too early, we are doomed. We have to wait to make the unpalatable paradigmatic. And that's what Bose did. Of course, there's a tragedy. He cracked up in the process. And what many people don't know is that the last of his researchers were all cooked up. He breaks down in the process of creating the very paradigm that he wanted to do. A cosmopolitan science. Not international, not national, not local. But between Tagore, Bose, and Geddes, they dreamt of the possibility of a post-Germanic university. A university that would go beyond anything the West had dreamt of. But a university would realize that there were other Wests, each of which had to be explored. And the possibility of the other West becomes fantastic in the Indian national movement. I can think of someone like Maria Montessori, who the English interned as an alien in India. And she sets up this epidemic of Montessori schools, which becomes the basis of a certain kind of education. So in fact, if you look at the Indian national movement, it's fascinating in its confidence. In fact, I remember one of the documents saying, the first goal of the Indian national movement is to rescue the British from their modernity. And they meant it. Because to a certain extent, they realized that you can't liberate yourself from your oppressors till you rescue the oppressor. And I think this conversation of master-slave, postulated in a more Hegelian sense, becomes, I think, one of the conversations of the liberal arts. How do you move from liberation to emancipation? How do you rescue the oppressor from his oppressiveness? How do you challenge power through a certain sense of a rereading of the classics? I want to take two more stories. I've got about 10 minutes? Okay. And I know a crusty woman who's probably one of India's finest writers. She looks like a housewife and is about lethal as 2 grenades. Mahashweta Devi. I mean, anyone who's met her would. You know, she has a way of kind of adopting you, and then before breakfast she'll say, Shiv, there's been an atrocity 100 miles away. Will you please leave immediately and report back to me? But she wrote a play called Draupadi. And I don't know how much you know the myth. It's about the whole question of the harassment, embarrassment, and the attempt to inflict indignity on a woman. It comes from the Mahabharata. There are mythical specialists here who could probably do better renditions and variations of it, but I'll stick to a kind of scientific description. In the standard story, Krishna saves her from humiliation. But Mahashweta makes 2 alterations. She makes Draupadi into Draupadi, who becomes tribal. And in the story, Draupadi, in fact, while she is being harassed and raped, suddenly stands up. She realizes her nakedness is her only weapon, and she challenges the oppressor. This play was produced in Manipur during the time the Indians were misbehaving with our own people. We do it quite often. And the play was stunning. The moment the actress takes off her clothes and moves from vulnerability to a different kind of vulnerability, challenges the tribal audience. And something strange happens. A few months later, one of the most classic protests in human rights takes place, just through a rereading of the gossip of this drama. The mothers of Manipur step up in front of the Assam Rifles headquarters where a woman had been raped. About 15 of them. They take off the clothes and tell the Indian Army, Assam Rifles, I dare you to rape us. A rereading of the document becomes a new creation of history. Stunning. And Manipur is full of these stories. And one of the things Jindal School hopes to do is, in fact, set up a research base there to, in fact, eventually ask for the removal of the Armed Forces Special Act. Liberal hearts might be irrelevant, but I think in a deep and fundamental way, it goes to the core of undermining statist sovereignty. And I'll take a final story, which I'm researching halfway, so historians of science will forgive me. Recently, I was reading a bit of Elementary Structures of Kinship by Levi-Strauss, and there's an appendix where he says, Levi-Strauss took the aboriginal kinship system to the French mathematician who belonged to the Bourbaki, André Weil. And he shows this to Weil, and Weil is stunned by the aboriginal kinship system. And he says it actually needs a new field of mathematics to understand it. And that's the time I started reading about André Weil, because I discovered he taught in India. He taught at Aligarh University as a young lecturer. And if you look at his autobiography, there's a brilliant section of it. What is also more interesting, it's Weil hired a mathematician who became later one of India's greatest historians, D.D. Kosambi, who couldn't get a job anywhere else. And Kosambi, in fact, writes the first fictionalized version of what became the greatest French mathematical school, the Bourbaki. In fact, it's in the records of the Aligarh school that you'll find the first references to Bourbaki as a collective mathematical school. The Bourbaki as French mathematicians were outstanding. But then there's Lorraine Graham, who writes a fascinating book, wondering whether André Weil ever talked to his sister, Simone Weil, the mystic. And there's a story that follows, and I'll end with that. The Bourbaki could not break the final dimensions of mathematical set theory. Lorraine Graham eventually shows that the group that breaks them is a group of Russian mystics, orthodox believers who use mystical numbers to create a new theory of mathematics. Of course, the tragedy is, as Graham points out, our friend, the great opposer of all liberal arts, Stalin, eliminates the entire group. But this Russian group of mystical people managed to do what 20th century's greatest mathematical school done. They create the new breakthroughs of set theory, which creates the new Soviet school of mathematics. Humanities talking to social sciences. Orthodox mystics talking to orthodox scientists. The possibility of democracy in terms of a dream of knowledge. And I think that's what Jindal is trying to create here. A quarrel, a conversation, a debate, a constituent assembly where a syllabus becomes the possibility of subverting a culture. It's an invitation to join in. Thank you.